there shall be signs in the sun, and in the moon, and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations, with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them for fear, and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth. For the powers of heaven shall be shaken. One man, one microphone, one mission, one message. True News, the only newscast reporting the countdown to the second coming of Jesus Christ. And now for the most powerful hour on radio, here is End Time Newsman, Rick Wiles.
This is True News, 1 hour of uncensored news, views, and commentary. Welcome to the program. I'm Rick Wiles. Today's Wednesday, April 1st, 2015. The State Department said today that U.S. negotiators will continue talks with Iran until at least Thursday morning. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu lashed out at Western nations for negotiating with Iran, while a high-level Iranian military commander vowed to wipe Israel off the map and to kill the leaders of Saudi Arabia. The Telegraph in London reported that a senior Israeli security source said Iran is smuggling rockets to Hezbollah in Lebanon that are outfitted with advanced guided warheads. Meanwhile, a coalition of Arab nations led by Saudi Arabia continue to carry out airstrikes on Yemeni rebels backed by Iran. A UN refugee camp in Yemen housing 18,000 refugees was hit by Saudi warplanes. 40 refugees were killed. UK Foreign Secretary Philip Hammond confirmed that British warplanes were used in the Saudi airstrikes in Yemen. The UN said Yemen was nearing total collapse as Saudi airstrikes and fierce street fighting worsened Yemen's humanitarian crisis. ISIS jihadists stormed a refugee camp in Syria near Damascus and took control. A third of 4 blood moons will appear this Saturday, Passover. Some people believe the blood moons are a heavenly sign that a world war will erupt in the Middle East. One thing is certain, there is a deliberate plan underway to set the Middle East on fire. The world is being reshaped. I'm fully persuaded that a sinister cabal of wealthy, powerful men and women and organizations are orchestrating many events throughout the world and guiding sweeping changes in culture, technology, laws, religion, science, and entertainment. They are making a new world. F. William Engdahl, a geopolitical analyst, strategic risk consultant, author, professor, and lecturer, was on this program in 2011. His website is williamengdahl.com. In the early days of the Egyptian uprising in 2011, I interviewed Mr. Engdahl about whether he believed that there was a plan underway to unleash chaos in the Middle East in order to remake the region. Here are some sound bites from that 2011 interview. After the sound bites from 2011, Mr. Engdahl will join us today from his home in Germany. This term creative destruction is a term that we've used on this program many times over the years. Are you of the belief that what is taking place in the Middle East is of design and not a spontaneous revolution?
There's no question about it, Rick. If you look closely behind the scenes, first of all, the RAND Corporation prepared a report in 2008 for the Pentagon, for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, for the Central Command, and the report was based on a intimate analysis of some of the mistakes that Kafaya made. Kafaya is the so-called Twitter Spontaneous Youth umbrella organization that's backing El Baradei's presidential candidacy and various other things. So the RAND Corporation has been deeply involved in this for several years, and not just Egypt. It goes across the Middle East, and it goes back to an agenda that was first made public before the G8 meeting in 2004 by George W. Bush, calling for creation of a greater Middle East, and he had all sorts of beautiful rhetoric about democracy and introducing, the Western free enterprise model and so forth. But we know what that means, as happened in Latin America in the 1980s. It means putting these countries under the debt grip of Wall Street and London banks and turning them essentially into satrapies of the U.S. even more than they are today.
Is this Freedom House, is this the organization that is training the revolutionaries in the streets of these Middle Eastern cities to challenge the established governments of their countries?
No question about it, but keep in mind that the former head of Freedom House only 4 or 5 years ago was James Woolsey, the former head of the CIA. The board of directors of Freedom House is a sampling of the highest elites of the establishment, including neoconservative wing of do with freedom. It was revamped in the late 1940s to become a lobby for NATO during the Cold War. So Freedom House, the National Endowment for Democracy, and its various four spin-offs, the Republican Institute, the Democratic Institute, the labor union arm of the National NED. And the founder of the NED said back in a Washington Post interview in 1990, the National Endowment for Democracy was created as a private NGO to do what 25 years ago the CIA used to do.
I've had other guests on this program who have explained the deep, long-running connection between the Muslim Brotherhood and the CIA going back to the 50s.
Yes, no question. That's documented. Not only that, the Muslim Brotherhood can be compared to something in the West analogous to the Freemasons. It's an Islamic Freemason kind of structure. It's a secret society. They've been outlawed in Egypt for more than 3 decades under Mubarak. And now they just announced not only is an Islamist going to write the commission to write a new constitution for Egypt, but the Muslim Brotherhood announced yesterday that they were going to form a political party for the election.
I mean, for whatever bad points Mubarak had, he had a stable country. What we're doing is we're introducing instability to a whole region.
And I think the target of this is really Western Europe. This is a Washington-instigated thing with the assist of the British intelligence. But the target is Western Europe and the nations of Eurasia, because China, Russia, the countries of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and so forth, these countries are getting closer and closer together economically. They're building pipelines, oil, gas pipelines. They're sharing military equipment, and they're creating a counterpole to a one superpower dictating the rules to the entire world.
Mr. F. William Engdahl is on the telephone. He is a geopolitical analyst, strategic risk consultant, author, professor, and lecturer. He is the author of numerous books, including Target China and Myths, Lies, and Oil Wars. Mr. Engdahl is on the telephone from his home in Germany. His website is WilliamEngdahl.com, and Engdahl is ENGDAHL, WilliamEngdahl.com. Mr. Engdahl, glad to have you back on the program.
It's good to be back with you, Rick.
William, we played those sound bites from your 2011 interview. This was at the time that Cairo was in turmoil, what appeared to be a popular uprising, which was later seized by the Muslim Brotherhood, and then they took power of Egypt, and then the Egyptian army later rose up and kicked out the Muslim Brotherhood. Looking back, you were spot on describing what was taking place.
Well, the events of the Arab Spring, I had written a book called Full Spectrum Dominance, analyzing how the CIA and the RAND Corporation, these NGOs like Open Society Foundations of George Soros, the Freedom House that you mentioned, the National Endowment for Democracy, the Republican Institute headed by Senator John McCain. Madeleine Albright heads the Democratic wing of the NED. And this is all one vast octopus of the CIA apparatus, U.S. intelligence, State Department apparatus, for forced regime change to get ornery governments that don't exactly agree with Washington's long-term agenda, to get them out of the way and get some puppets in there like billionaire oligarch in Ukraine today, Petro Poroshenko, or numerous others that they've handpicked and installed. The events in Egypt, I had been following it quite closely because the Middle East is, of course, highly strategic for the geopolitical terrain of Eurasia, China, Russia, the emerging countries, Iran, and so forth. And I had been expecting, because China is dependent on Middle East oil channels, I'd been expecting some kind of dramatic event. I didn't calculate that they would be so desperate, Washington, that they would trigger and unleash across the entirety of the Middle East these color revolutions called the Arab Spring in 2011, 2012. They indeed did, and I think that's something that's an indication not of the strength of their position, these neocons in Washington, the Pentagon military-industrial faction. There are genuine patriotic senior officers and enlisted men in the U.S. Armed Forces that genuinely love their country, but there's a cabal inside there, a deep state cabal that's hooked up with the CIA, it's hooked up with Israeli military and intelligence services, it's hooked up with narco traffic and unbelievable other things. For example, Afghanistan and the poppy heroin cultivation that exploded after the U.S. occupation in 2002. So this is the apparatus we're looking at, and when I did the preliminary investigation on the events in Tunisia and then immediately after that in Egypt, it was clear to me that the Obama agenda, the Obama administration agenda, was to use the Muslim Brotherhood, a death cult. It's nothing other than a death cult, and I document this in a new book that I've just finished. It'll be available to the English-speaking world in, I estimate, end of May, early June, if the printing schedule goes as planned. And it's called The Lost Hegemon, meaning the United States elites, not the United States as a nation, but the elites, Rockefeller, Soros, Buffett, Bill Gates, and names that are not so well known but are equally powerful. And the subtitle is Whom the Gods Would Destroy, because I think that best describes the situation of the shadowy people who are driving with their money, with their instruments of fear and so forth, are driving Washington policy to make this absolutely insane war in Ukraine, to provoke Putin and Russia into doing something foolish, which thank God they haven't so far. But this is the war faction. The neocons are little else than a bunch of whores or prostitutes for the military-industrial complex, and they could be Israeli neocons, they could be Democratic neocons like the new Defense Secretary Ashton Carter or Susan B. Rice, who seems to, dream of having blood on her hands when she goes to sleep at night, if she sleeps, I don't know. But she is one of the most bloodthirsty people who's ever been a national security advisor of a president, and that list includes Kissinger and Brzezinski, so that says a lot. So this faction literally needs to have war, unrest globally because they're losing power everywhere. And that's the important thing, I think, for listeners to keep in mind. We give them power. When we talk about how evil they are, how powerful they are, and so forth, they're not. Their power depends on us agreeing, us being hypnotized in awe of their power. And in reality, they're a bunch of pathetic, loveless people.
I really think that they're psychopaths.
Well, yes, of course, you can use clinical terms and so forth, but I think that gives them too much credit. They're power-addicted, loveless people. I think that describes them best. You look at the face of a George Soros on one of his recent interviews, and he looks like the Walking Dead. He's not a man filled with love and joy. There are people who have money who actually are human beings who have love and joy and express that in their eyes. I feel sorry for them if they weren't so cold-blooded, but, their problem.
I have to look at some of these guys like Rockefeller, David Rockefeller, Kissinger, and you have to wonder what type of science are they using to keep these old geezers going? No, I'm serious. They're keeping these guys alive. 5 years ago, I asked you about the Muslim Brotherhood and U.S. intelligence agencies. You described the Muslim Brotherhood as Islamic Freemasons. William,
Freemason-like, yes.
Yes, Freemason-like. Okay, this is my question. Is this cabal, is there a dark, occult-like side to this thing, or is it all about power and money?
The Muslim Brotherhood was set up in Egypt in the 1920s. I think British intelligence played a key role in it. The Vatican, the Jesuits or something similar to that, I'm convinced also played a very hidden role in giving them the concept, the model for their organization, because it's highly sophisticated. It has several levels of reality, and behind all of those levels is, at the core of it, is a death cult. And Hassan al-Banna, the founder, back in 1926, wrote about this in his writings, and he said the greatest glory, and this is not in the Quran, this is Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Brotherhood, is to die in the name of Allah. And if you don't kill, and if you're not killed in the name of Allah, then lived a worthless life. That's a pretty heavy message.
All right, you're describing the Muslim Brotherhood as a death cult. Now let's think about the Skull and Bones secret society, which George W. Bush belongs to. John Kerry belongs to it. A lot of people, it is actually known as the Brotherhood of Death. And you described Susan Rice as having a bloodlust. The question I'm asking,
look at every action she's been involved in.
I agree.
She convinced Obama to do the bombing of Libya back to the Stone Age. Libya under Gaddafi had built up one of the most prosperous, stable, peaceful economies in all of Africa. Nobody had poverty. He used the oil revenues. He didn't privatize it to British Petroleum or ExxonMobil like so many of the African countries or Middle East did. He kept it under state control and used that money. When people married in Libya under Gaddafi, they got a home, a young couple to start raising a family. They got $10,000 in cash to begin their new life. They had free medical, free health care, free education. All the tribes that constitute Libya were more or less at peace. So the only way they could destabilize Gaddafi was to bomb them and to manufacture false flag, Gulf of Tonkin kind of incidents in Benghazi in the east, and try to convince some of the tribes that they would get a bigger cut of the pie if they went with the CIA.
Right. So we had Susan Rice and Hillary Clinton and others who told one outrageous lie after another to justify the NATO bombing of Libya. And then you look at...
They called it responsibility to protect, and that's an invention of some people around George Soros, that certain humanitarian situations are so morally compelling that we have a responsibility to protect. Well, who decides the responsibility? Of course, the CIA and the Pentagon. And to my mind, we have a United Nations that should at least have a chance to debate such things.
Yes, we have
found out that Hillary Clinton was lying to the world about the situation in Libya, that Susan B. Rice was lying to the world, as was Samantha Power, the three primary people who forced a weak President Obama to, simply, okay, you guys take it over and you decide what to do. Well, of course, they decided for the bloody path.
So we have humanitarian bombing campaigns. But going back to my question about Susan Rice and Hillary Clinton, John McCain, Lindsey Graham, it doesn't matter which side of the political spectrum, these people have a bloodlust. And if they have a bloodlust, there's something evil and wicked there. This is where I'm trying to get at. William, is there something far more sinister below the surface than what we are realizing? Is this more than just a lust for power and money and greed?
Well, I think it's, in the end, quite simple. And that is that these, I call them in one of my books, the gods of money, the ones who run Wall Street, the six banks that have gotten trillions of dollars of taxpayer and Fed money over the last 6-7 years since the crisis broke in 2007, 2008, that these unbelievably rich, the American oligarchs, I like to call them. We talk about Russian oligarchs, Ukrainian oligarchs. Well, we have American oligarchs. And my goodness, they think that they own the country, and they don't. They think that they own the people of the country. And at the bottom of it, their agenda is very simple. Kill others before others kill them. It boils down to that. The Rockefeller family has been the biggest supporter of eugenics, which is nothing but racism, how to kill off as many people as possible. The Rockefeller Foundation financed the creation of genetic manipulation, molecular biology, beginning in 1938, to find out ways of fiddling with human genes so that they could sterilize people without their knowing it and select the best of the breed for their future generations and kill off the rest down to a point where you just have a few 100 million drones, as Ted Turner once talked about. Excuse me. And to do to take out their garbage of these oligarchs and clean up their messes. But they essentially hate themselves, and therefore they project that onto hating people, human beings.
William, fast forward to today, the issue with Iran. What's the big picture? What's the game plan here with Iran?
Well, I think it's quite simply to split the de facto alliance between Iran, China, and Russia, which constitutes what I describe often in my talks around the world as a kind of iron triangle of resistance to the Washington New World Order of Obama, Bush, Rockefeller, et cetera, ad nauseum. They want to defend their national sovereignty. They say we have a right to shape our national laws and our economic policies as we see fit and not as some other nation sees fit. And so the Obama administration is they tried to stick for since 1979-80 against Iran, and now they're trying a little bit the carrot. We'll lift your sanctions if you play ball with us on this nuclear question. And it's really not about the nuclear question. I think they want to use that to create maximum fractionalization on another level in the Middle East, since their Arab Spring experiment has blown up in their faces so mightily. So they're trying to appear to tilt toward Iran so that the Saudis, the Kuwaitis, Qatar, the Emirates, and Egypt, as well as Israel, form an alliance against the growing power of Iran, which isn't, it's a minority within Islam, and the numbers of the Shiite Muslims worldwide are something like 1/10 of the numbers of the Sunni, the Saudi and other strains.
William,
so it's just to create as much chaos, as much disorder, so that the world doesn't get its act together and put these guys out to pasture. And it's often, I think, many of us don't realize how vulnerable they are. These loveless oligarchs, how their world is threatened as it has never been in 200-300 years.
So is perpetual chaos and disorder and instability necessary for them to continue their reign of power?
That's the only means that they see possible, as I see it. They tried, the financial thing to simply use globalization and as a Trojan horse to loot the economies of other nations, Latin America in the 80s, and then it went to Eastern Europe and Russia, and so in the 90s, under Yeltsin in Russia, shock therapy and all these things. It was a looting operation to prop up the U.S. banks and the dollar. That reached its limits, so then they opened up China, for the World Trade Organization in the mid-90s, late 90s. Then they had the Asia crisis to open up the tiger economies to loot them, which they did rather successfully, and Japan in the early 90s. Now they're at a point where there is no big new area for them to suck off of, like the bloodsuckers that they are, the leeches that they are, parasites, without making wars. And I think one of the secondary factors of the Arab Spring was that Mubarak, Gaddafi, and Ben Ali, the then president of Tunisia, were in the process of using their national economies, their wealth, their sovereign wealth funds, to create Islamic banking that would have been independent from the U.S. dollar. And if Wall Street loses the role of the dollar as reserve currency, if Washington loses that, the U.S. Treasury, they have lost the game. The only thing left they have are guns. And there are two pillars that have supported the power of this American oligarchy since 1945, and that is the one pillar is the strongest military power on the face of the earth. The second one is the role of the dollar and the dollar as reserve currency.
Military power. What explains this showdown, this very dangerous, high-stakes showdown over Ukraine?
Very simply, they were about to lose not just Ukraine, they were about to lose Germany and Western Europe, they meaning the American oligarchs. Because Ukraine, Yanukovych, the elected president of Ukraine, by the way, in case anybody bothers to be interested, Yanukovych in November 2013 had two options he was looking at. One would be an associate membership in the European Union, a very, very poor offer. They would have to restructure the economy dramatically. They would have to privatize to Western investors. They wouldn't get billions of dollars of money as they had dreamed of from the EU. The EU is de facto bankrupt itself with the crisis in Greece, Portugal, Spain, Italy, partly in France, and so forth. The other option was an offer from Vladimir Putin and Russia to join the emerging Eurasian Economic Union with Belarus, Russia, Kazakhstan, and now it includes Armenia, and that would orient Ukraine in a natural way with a dramatic reduction in natural gas from Russia. The price would be cut by one-third what they were paying before. They would get, I think, $16 or $15 billion of loans from Russia to buy Ukrainian state debt, and there would be no IMF conditionalities attached to the Ukrainian economy. Once Yanukovych announced his decision to, and it was quite a rational decision, to go with Putin's offer, Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State for that region, and John McCain and the CIA, John Knuckle-Dragger Brennan, as they call him, went into action with a color revolution Mach 2 like they did in 2004, and they had trained 6 months beforehand in Poland in a secret NATO base. They had trained dozens and dozens of neo-Nazis in the organization called the Right Sector, Pravi Sector, in Ukrainian. They brought them over there and trained them to be sharpshooters, to do terror actions against police, how to penetrate police barriers, steel barriers and shields that they hold up with Molotov cocktails and so forth, incendiary weapons that get into the clothes and you burn police alive, and there are videos of this. That's what they were doing. So this Maidan Square was really run by these CIA-trained and NATO-trained terrorists, the Pravi sector, and they are the ones that Victoria Nuland and the U.S. ambassador in Kiev, who seems to me that more and more American ambassadors have no requirement to know anything about diplomacy. They just have to be former CIA agents and terrorists and special forces operatives who can run these terror operations in various countries. So Jeffrey Pyatt is today the true president of Ukraine, and he's an American.
Well, William, is Vladimir Putin preparing for a nuclear showdown with the United States over this?
That's the only choice he has right now, given what the United States has prepared with ballistic missile installations in Poland, the Czech Republic, Turkey, Bulgaria in the last 7 years, directly aimed at Russia. The U.S. is preparing, the U.S. military, and the American citizens have not been told this, the U.S. military, the doctrine is to prepare for a nuclear first strike against Russia. And if you know your opponent is preparing a first strike, you're on a hair trigger to get there before he does, before you're destroyed. So this is the most mad insanity that any Washington government has ever signed on to. It was Donald Rumsfeld's pet project when he was Secretary of War. He wasn't Secretary of Defense. He was truly Secretary of War under George W. Bush. And this is the military-industrial complex. You know, they faced drastic budget cuts before this Ukraine business, the sequestration and all these things. Now, you know, people are saying, we have to find a way to give the Pentagon money. Let's slash the education and health budgets and, you know, food stamps and so forth so that we can get more guns and bullets into Ukraine and get those nasty Russians. Well, even Henry Kissinger is getting a little bit alarmed at the Obama administration's drum rolls of war here with Ukraine and Russia.
How high?
Ukrainians and Russians. I was in Moscow a week ago. They consider themselves one. They've never been at each other's throats like this before. So this is all instigated from outside, and it's made in Washington, and that's a message that the mainstream media in America has blocked out to the American public, how we are being manipulated to essentially prepare for a war that the Europeans would wage for these mad hatters in Washington and the Pentagon and Wall Street, to keep their dreams of empire alive, I suppose.
All right. Second question, China's new Asian Infrastructure Bank.
Yes.
Most of America's allies have signed on. Secretary Jack Lew, Treasury Secretary Jack Lew, was in Beijing days ago meeting with the Chinese premier. We don't know if the U.S. secretly signed on to the bank or not, or what was the purpose of that meeting the day before the deadline. How serious of a threat is this bank, or should I say how serious of a threat is China's challenge to the dominant position of the U.S. dollar?
Well, it's the U.S. dollar, which is really, it used to be backed by gold in the 50s and the 60s up until 1971. Then after that, in 73, it was essentially a petrodollar because the price of oil had been rigged by Henry Kissinger in the Yom Kippur War and the Arab oil embargo, all of this, the Bilderberg meeting in May of that year. I documented in my book, A Century of War, in unique detail. But so supported by petrodollars from Arab OPEC countries that were oil. U.S. Treasury made sure that oil would only be sold by OPEC in return for U.S. dollars, not for German marks or Japanese yen or French franc, but only U.S. dollars. So that Germany had to get 400% more U.S. dollars somehow, and that kept the dollar afloat for another couple decades. But today, the only thing holding up, we've rotted out our economy and national economy. America no longer produces like it did when I was a kid in the 50s and the 60s. We used to be a great industrial nation, creative engineers, scientists, and so forth. And now we've outsourced everything. The multinationals, through the free trade rules, has outsourced for cheap labor, and it's not the fault of the Chinese, but it's to China, to Russia, to Eastern Europe, to Africa, to South America, you name it. And so the banks, the financial oligarchs, don't care a whit about American people or American stability or health and welfare. They care about their own power addiction. You know, it's like a heroin addict hooked on power. And
so, what about this bank? This new China
The
bank?
bank is a fundamental threat to that because the IMF and the World Bank were created at Bretton Woods in 1944 to create a dollar system empire. They deliberately talked about this at the time, the planners. They said, we won't do it like the British. We won't call ours an American empire. we'll, because Americans don't like to think of themselves as imperialists, and so we'll call it the spread of democracy and the free enterprise way of life. And it's free for David Rockefeller and his friends, but it's certainly not free for the middle-sized companies and the heart of American business. So the IMF and the World Bank exist under American veto power to this day. They're controlled by the U.S. Treasury, and they're steered by Wall Street's demands. And that is the heart of the dollar system. If that goes, American power in the world, their ability to wage wars in the Middle East, to wage wars in Ukraine and so forth, it will dry up. And suddenly the emperor will stand there naked with no clothes, as the fairy tale from Denmark talks about. So the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank is a Chinese project to finance the huge demand for infrastructure that would link the Chinese economy with that of Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Russia, Central Asian republics, the Koreas, and so forth. And suddenly the British smelled the potential in this, and they said, wait a minute, if we're on the outside looking in, we're going to be in a very weak position. Let's try to get on the inside. And once they did it, Germany and France jumped in. The U.S. Treasury screamed and yelled at all these allied countries, so-called, not to do this because the bank had no guidelines like the IMF or the World Bank. Well, those are guidelines of Wall Street. So it was a hollow message the U.S. had. And now I think they're frantically trying to figure out a way to control this thing and to stop it. But the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa group of countries also created last fall a BRICS investment bank for financing projects in those countries and allied countries. So these institutions are developing the counterweight to the heart of the dollar system power, and that is the IMF and the World Bank.
Is this going to coalesce now? Are we at the point now that this new financial architecture is going to coalesce and most nations are going to gravitate to it in the very near future?
We're close. We're not there yet. And the CIA and Washington, with their color revolutions, are trying to destabilize the individual BRICS countries. Just look at what they're doing with sanctions against Putin in Russia, what they're doing with Rousseff in Brazil, with the protest financed by George Soros and the National Endowment for Democracy. So they're trying to destabilize and weaken this emerging order, but it won't work because the world is fed up with these wars, these games of it's always the same tiresome agenda of killing people and thinking you're doing something good.
All right,
killing people, and people are realizing America's not doing anything good in the world by going to Iraq and killing Shia and killing Sunni and using drones to destroy families and lives and so forth. That's not good. That's bad. And they're realizing the people who put them up to this are bad people. And that's the change that I sense is going on, and it's very positive.
All right. Last question, if we can keep this to 2 minutes. What do you anticipate is the next one or two things that you see will happen or develop in the world in the coming year?
I think we're going to have an unprecedented tectonic split, continental Western Europe led by Germany and France versus the Atlantic led by Washington. Germany, of course, is an occupied country since 1945. The U.S. government has levers of control, U.S. intelligence and so forth. They have blackmail dossiers on Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany. They have blackmail on virtually every prominent person in the country, you can be sure. But at a certain point, the outrageousness of Washington actions, Victoria Nuland, with her famous comment about the F word against the European Union, we're running this show last year, when she installed this coup d'etat dictatorship in Kiev. Europeans are realizing that there is no mutual interest within NATO anymore.
How far would the cabal go to stop it?
Oh, I think they'd try anything, assassination, whatever they can do to spread democracy and human rights.
Humanitarian assassinations, yes.
Yes, humanitarian assassination, something the CIA is very, very cultured about.
A lot to think about. My guest, Mr. F. William Engdahl, some of his books, Target China, also Myths, Lies, Oil Wars, his website, williamengdahl.com. Thank you so much, William.
Thank you, Rick. I enjoyed it very much.
Reporting the countdown to the second coming of Jesus Christ, you're listening to True News, the End Time Newscast.
This is Max McLean. How do we show ourselves to be wise and understanding? Listen to the Bible from James 3. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show it by his good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, of the devil. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace raise a harvest of righteousness. From James 3. Listen to the Bible. It's great for the soul.
This is True News. We are your daily vaccine to protect your mind from mental viruses spread by the establishment news media. The safety of vaccines, that's the topic of today's interview. Environmentalist activist Robert Kennedy Jr. is traveling throughout the United States promoting the film Trace Amounts. Big Pharma is not happy with this film because it raises disturbing questions about the link between thimerosal in vaccines and autism. The film's website is traceamounts.com. And the co-producers, Mr. Eric GLADEN and Shiloh Levine, are on the telephone to tell us why they made this film and why you should see it. Eric and Shiloh, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. Eric, let's start with you. You have a very interesting story of why you are personally involved in this film. So introduce it to our audience.
Okay, so back in 2004, when I was 29 years old, I was building my fence in my backyard and had a little mishap with a rusty nail. So I hadn't had a tetanus shot in over 10 years, so I went down to the local urgent care, got a tetanus shot, and to make a long story short, ended up very sick, neurologically for the most part, and psychologically as well. And it was all pinned to the thimerosal, which was in the tetanus shot. So thimerosal is a mercury-based preservative, really has nothing to do with the efficacy of the vaccine at all. It's simply only used in the vaccine to save money and be lazy and unsterile during the manufacturing. So once I went through a process of what's called chelation, where I take these drugs that remove the mercury from my body and brain, all my symptoms went away in a period of about 6 months. Everything was totally resolved. So, and then
Eric, how long did you go before you took the chelation treatment to remove it?
I got the shot on January 18, 2004, and the way mercury works, from a single exposure, it takes about 3 months for everything to kick in. You get symptoms right away, but 3 months later is when all the neurological symptoms had fully came to. So about 3 months after the shot, I was seeing doctors after doctors. I had already been seeing doctors, but all the neurologists by this time. And probably about a month later is when I started the mercury chelation. So about 4 months after getting the shot, I started the treatment. And about 6 months after that, all my symptoms were gone. It's a very slow process. You want to kind of remove the mercury very carefully and slowly because you can really cause a lot of damage by redistributing it into other areas of the brain and so forth. So it's a very, very slow process, let's put it that way. But I fully recovered.
And tell us again, what were the symptoms?
They started out within a day or two of getting the tetanus shot. I came down with flu-like symptoms and fever and nausea and all that kind of stuff. And then I kind of kicked out of that. And then I just had major fatigue. It's like I was going to bed at 7 o'clock every night trying to figure out couldn't get enough sleep, let's say. And then it developed much more into like ear symptoms. I woke up one morning and it's like somebody turned the volume of my ears up, and I could hear every noise that you just don't want to hear on this planet. And that's kind of what started going to the doctors. And then so I was seeing ear doctors, ear, nose, and throat doctors. Then it developed more into other senses. My vision became extremely sensitive to light. I had visual tracers. And then all the muscles, nerves in my head, face and neck all started becoming very tense, like I couldn't relax anything. And then more of the muscle twitching kicked in, and tremors and burning, and I went down a very bad path of neurological symptoms. And then, I was seeing doctor after doctor trying to figure out what neurological condition do I have. And while they were doing MRIs and EEGs and all the different neurological tests, blood tests, urine tests, hair analysis, they were doing the whole spectrum of everything. I had actually came across mercury poisoning several times while researching my symptoms. And I did talk to one of my neurologists about it. I'm like, what about mercury? Well, my symptoms are identical. And he's like, that could just make your foot go numb. But he was right in my mind. Like, where would I have been exposed to mercury? I knew he didn't know what mercury poisoning was because he didn't know the symptoms. But at the same time, I'm like, where would I have possibly got a mercury exposure? And we ruled that out. And it was probably a month after that where I spent day by day tracing every single symptom and when it started. And everything started right when I got that tetanus shot. And at first I thought I got tetanus. I knew everything started that day I scratched my head on that nail. So I asked my other neurologist, I'm like, what about tetanus? This is when everything started right here. I pinned it to the day. And he's like, there's no way it's tetanus. And we went home, typed in tetanus shot, mercury poisoning, and hits everywhere. And the whole light bulb, all the light bulbs came on. And that sparked the research.
Did you ever find a doctor who understood it and helped you?
Yeah, in fact, my next step was I contacted Dr. Andrew Cutler, who's a PhD in chemistry from Princeton. Read his book. He had a book out there on it, and I could tell the second I read that book, I knew this guy knew what he was talking about. I contacted him, found a practitioner that knew how to use his protocol to treat it safely, to get the mercury out of the body and brain safely, and went up to Seattle, saw a specialist up there that implemented his protocol on me, and that's what made me recover.
Very interesting. And what was the deadly ingredient that brought this about?
Well, it was thimerosal is a preservative in in a lot of vaccines. Right now, the biggest threat is the flu shot. It's still in tetanus, it's still in meningitis. There's specific vaccines that it's in. It has been removed from some. But this stuff was invented in the late 20s. It was implemented in vaccines in the early 30s. Never went through any kind of clinical trials. It was the only safety study ever done on it was done on 22 terminally ill meningitis patients in the late 20s, early 30s, and all of them died. A lot of them died within a day. And that to this day, you referenced FDA safety testing on thimerosal, and that's the study they referenced. A study where they exposed all these terminally ill meningitis patients with thimerosal, extremely high doses, 1% solution, and all 22 of them died. So, it was grandfathered in because it was FDA didn't really have jurisdiction over it at the time, and once they did, it was grandfathered in, and to this day, in 2015, we're still using it, which is unbelievable.
And what is the purpose of it in a vaccine?
They simply use it during the manufacturing process, so they don't have to have an ultra-sterile environment. They can just dump a bunch of thimerosal in there and not worry about bacteria growing, so they're saving money and shortcutting. And then they use it so they can load a 10-dose vial and keep breaking the barrier with the needle to load it without worrying about bacteria introducing into the dose, into the multi-dose. So it's a preservative. It's simply to save money. That's it. They can have single-dose vials. You do not need thimerosal. There's other alternates, preservatives that they can use. This is the cheapest way to preserve, package, and ship these things, and it is unfortunately caused a lot of damage, specifically in children who were exposed to this.
The test that you cited in the 1920s, tell me once again, who or what were the guinea pigs? Humans or animals?
There was an outbreak in Indianapolis, which is where Eli Lilly, the inventor of thimerosal, is. There was an outbreak of meningitis, so 144 people came down with meningitis, infections of the brain, basically. And they took the subset group of 22 of those patients and exposed them to 1% solution. They had already been testing it on animals previous to this, and at that same dose-dependent the levels, given I think it was rabbits, I want to say, it killed them in laboratory. So now they're giving these same exposures to humans after they'd already determined that it killed animals in laboratory. And again, it killed all 22. Well, they claim that they all died of meningitis. However, there's much more indication that it was the thimerosal that killed them.
Well, and all of them died, and most of them died within a day
right.
of receiving that thimerosal dose.
And this stuff is still in vaccines? And that's the foundation study that has permitted it all these years?
That is the one and only safety study ever done on thimerosal that has allowed this to be injected into children.
One and only? Are you saying there's never been a study since that time?
Well, they've done epidemiology studies. They've never done biological and clinical science. All the biological and clinical science done on thimerosal shows this to be toxic down to parts per billion. I mean, this is extremely neurotoxic, far more toxic than lead. And, yes, the only safety study in order to allow that into drugs has been that one single study by Eli Lilly and on those 22 meningitis patients. It's unbelievable.
This is criminal malfeasance.
Yeah, but it goes far beyond that. That's the least compelling thing in the movie. Let's put it that way. There's something called the Freedom of Information Act, where you can access, you can put in FOIA requests, or what they're called, where you can access government employee emails, CDC emails, FDA emails, closed-door transcript meetings. And over the years, a lot of organizations like Safe Minds and Brian Hooker and his team, he's a PhD out of Northern California, have gone after and obtained so many of these emails and so many of these transcripts of closed-door meetings. And that's what we kind of do in this film, is show the entire history from 1931 all the way till now, exactly how this all played out, exactly when they realized how much mercury these kids were getting in the vaccines and what they did afterwards. It's by far one of the biggest crimes against humanity this world will ever see, I guarantee it. It's almost unbelievable.
Let me ask you this, Shiloh, if you know, if I went down to our city's public reservoir for the drinking water and I dumped mercury in it, what would happen to me?
Right.
What would happen to me?
You'd be arrested. If it was known, you would be arrested. It's illegal to dump the 25 micrograms that's found in our flu shots into a toilet or into a public water system.
Wait a minute, it's illegal.
It's illegal.
It's illegal to dump the same amount into the public drinking water as Big Pharma puts into the vaccines.
That is correct.
If you look at one vaccine that's got thimerosal on one flu shot, let's say, that's given to pregnant women all over this country right now, this day, one of those shots, you'd have to weigh 551 pounds to be within the federal guideline for mercury exposure. And that is unbelievable. And during the 90s, when these kids were getting the biggest doses of mercury from around 89 through about 2003, you know, these children would have to weigh 1,400 pounds to be within the federal guideline at their 2-month baby shots.
And that corresponds with that date corresponds with the explosion of autism in this country.
Absolutely. The published data shows that right around 1989 was the exact start of the explosion of autism. For 5-6 decades, you know, everyone says 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 5 decades, but keep in mind, of those first 11 children ever diagnosed with autism in the 40s, they were alive during the 30s. So, you know, there was autism through the 30s as well. So for those exact decades, children were getting 4 DTP shots with 25 micrograms of mercury each. It was constant level. And then in 89, they added, you know, between 89 and 1992, they added 4 HIVs, 25 micrograms each, so they doubled the mercury exposures. And then they added 3 more hepatitis Bs, 12.5 micrograms each. So they went from cumulative exposure of 100 micrograms to 237.5 micrograms in 3 years, and autism exploded over it. And it wouldn't be until 1998 that they did the math to see how much exposures these kids were getting, and they freaked out when they saw it. And what they did after that was almost unbelievable.
And what was that?
Well, they took an initial step in the right direction. The American Academy of Pediatrics said right away, we've got to remove thimerosal from childhood vaccines as soon as possible. That's their exact words in a joint statement issued in 1999. And then the CDC resisted this. They didn't want to label some vaccines good and others bad, so they didn't recall these vaccines. They kept manufacturing them through 2001. Backstock lasted at least through 2003. And then as soon as that backstock ran out, in 2004, they did the even more unbelievable thing. They added flu shots to all pregnant women, no matter what the trimester. And giving it to a developing fetus doesn't even compare. It's far worse than giving it to a baby who is, you know, producing bile, sweating, and urinating, has some ability to excrete. The theory behind mercury is it hits those that can excrete mercury the least affected. Now you're targeting the entire population that has zero ability to excrete. These are the developing fetuses. And then they added flu shots to babies to the first year of life and every year after that. So right now, we're almost, everyone thinks mercury's been removed. The rates keep going up. That's not even close to the truth. First of all, it hasn't been removed. Second of all, it's probably worse because we're giving it to developing fetuses, which we weren't before. And in 2009, we gave them a flu shot and a swine flu shot, 2 fully loaded mercury shots, never been done before. And people like to claim that mercury's been removed, the autism rates keep going up. And they forget to even acknowledge, or they don't even know, to tell you the truth, they don't look at the data. The latest autism rate of right now, 1 in 68, is based on children born in 2002. So these kids got the fully loaded backstock of thimerosal vaccine and then started getting flu shots in 2004. So this is potentially the highest exposed group yet.
Shallow, Robert Kennedy Jr. is devoting a lot of time and effort to promoting the film Trace Amounts. He's been in a lot of cities, Austin, Texas, Atlanta, Georgia, and so forth. Why is Mr. Kennedy so interested in this film?
And he'll be in Sacramento next on April 7th. He's so interested because he was approached by mothers a decade ago saying, if you're so concerned about mercury environmentally, I want to show you something else. It's in our vaccines. And they kept at him and really gained him as a champion of this cause. And he's written a book recently called Thimerosal, Let the Science Speak, which is a companion to our film because it contains hundreds of results of hundreds of studies that are linking neurological damage from thimerosal. So he just believes in this cause wholeheartedly and knows that it needs to be removed from all of our vaccines.
Does Mr. Kennedy have an autistic child?
No, he does not, and he doesn't have any personal story in that way other than that he just believes in it so deeply.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is somebody who doesn't have anything in the fight here. He's somebody that's literally just looked at the science, realized the science exists that proves mercury is extremely neurotoxic and is causing brain injury to children all over this world, and he wants to do something about it. And that fuels his passion in the science. Nothing to do with a personal interest in this or knowing anybody with autism or any of that nature. That's what makes him really stand out from others. He's never been affected. He's literally just got after the science and came to the same conclusion that we have.
If big pharma and big government both know that this is dangerous and it's harming people, why do they protect it and allow it to continue?
That's a question nobody knows the answer to.
That's a tough one.
They studied the vaccine safety data link right after that joint statement was made. So in 1999, they started looking at the vaccine safety data link, which is a huge database of medical records, children's medical records, and they found astronomical relative risk between thimerosal and autism. And really, at that time, figured out what was causing this explosion in autism. And then we have all their emails that showed what they did after they found that huge relative risk in order to, over the next 4 renditions of the study before it was published, water down the results in every way you could possibly imagine to get that relative risk down to 1 and tell the entire public that thimerosal is not linked to autism. And it's unbelievable what they did. So after 5 years of covering their tracks, why they now started giving pregnant women these fully loaded mercury flu shots, no one could ever imagine knowing the answer to that. It's unbelievable. And it's either completely gross negligence and they don't know what they're doing, or they did it because they knew where the rates were going to go when the mercury was fully removed.
Yeah.
And that's what I can't get myself to believe that, but there are many people that do believe that's why they did it.
And in the Simpsonwood transcripts, you do see that they had a fear of lawsuits, that they were worried about the erosion of the vaccine program. So that's the only thing that we've seen in transcripts. Otherwise, it's just guessing.
I also noticed during my I've seen over years how the lapdogs in the news media for big pharma go after anybody who questions the link between vaccines and various neurological disorders. What's been the response to Trace Amounts? I mean, I quickly scanned some of the news headlines, and I saw where various news writers were saying unkind things about you. What have you guys experienced?
Yeah, so everyone starts by labeling us anti-vaccine, immediately. And I want to make it very clear, we're not. We're specific to thimerosal. You can remove thimerosal instantly without affecting the vaccine supply. That is a huge thing here. And we're in no way anti-vaccine. We're about making these things safer and restoring the system, restoring faith in the program, instead of just forcing and mandating all these vaccines on people. We want to make them safer. So, and that's fine. Everyone kind of groups us right away into anti-vaccine. However, the biggest people out there slamming us once they see the film, and I'm talking legislators, I'm talking journalists, once they watch the film, I've had countless people approach me and say, "Oh my God, I didn't know any of this," and they're furious because they've been writing about this kind of like slamming us like everyone else does, and they've come to understand that they've been completely fooled because now they're seeing the government agencies who have been misleading them. They're seeing their emails, their transcript meetings. They're listening to Bill Thompson, a 17-year senior scientist who led 3 of those big studies that disproved the link, is talking in our film. And they're hearing other CDC officials talk, and they're seeing everything that laid out in history without knowing any of it because they've only listened to what they've been told by the CDC and those who have liability and financial at stake here. And they're watching this, and they're more furious than we are because they're embarrassed that they've been writing from the other side for so long without knowing what the true story is and what really happened. So, I mean, these people watch it, and we've never been slammed by one journalist who's watched this film. I've never been approached by one person that has stood up against anything that's in this film, that's watched the film. And I'm sure it's coming. I'm sure there's still some people that will. However, once you watch this, it's no longer us giving them the information. It's the CDC's information being presented. And if you're going to argue with our film then, you're not arguing with us anymore. You're arguing with the CDC, and you're arguing with the CDC scientists. And so we feel very strongly that's why we have not been slammed by people who have watched the film, because once you watch it, you'll see, too, that we're just presenting the history and not just having talking heads tell what happened. We're showing what happened with their emails. And it just takes a whole different dimension when we're showing them what these powers that be actually did with their own documents.
And the history and the science that exists that the media is not talking about.
Yes. Very scientific film. We literally got it proven down to the cell. In many ways. It's so proven that it would be against the entire universe if mercury wasn't causing a substantial percentage of this autism epidemic. The primary cause.
Shiloh, last question. How can our audience see this film, Trace Amounts?
So on April 2nd, you can go to traceamounts.com, and we have ability to do digital downloads, rentals, and to purchase DVDs. That's this April 2nd at traceamounts.com. And also we have a few more screenings left. We have a screening in Baltimore and let me pull it up real quick. A screening in Baltimore on April 7th, in Annapolis April 14th, Arlington, Virginia, April 16th. And you can go to traceamounts.com for that information as well. And people all over the country are hosting this film in their own cities, just regular people who want to bring this film to their communities can do so through our website as well.
All right, so this Thursday, April 2nd, it's available on the website for digital download.
That is correct.
And are the DVDs available now?
The DVDs will be available to order on April 2nd,
Everything.
As well as the rental.
Okay.
Yes, everything, floodgates open on April 2nd.
All right. So April 2nd, this Thursday, the film Trace Amounts and the website traceamounts.com. And the co-producers, our guests today, Eric Gladden and Shiloh Levine. Thank you so much. We appreciate what you've done.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rick.
Hey, here's a message to True News listeners in Nevada. I plan to attend the National Association of Broadcasters Convention in mid-April at the Las Vegas Convention Center, and I'd like to meet everybody in Las Vegas and Nevada that would like to get together sometime that week. I'm looking at Tuesday, April 14. If you think you could make it to a True News meeting in Las Vegas that day, give us a call at 772-569-8880 or email us at info@truenews.com and put Las Vegas in the subject line. God bless. See you tomorrow.